Stay down here if you don't mind. In fact, excuse me, we have in our congregation at Webb Chapel what we call No Tie July. I do that there, and when I come over here, I have to wear one because it's not official unless I wear a tie. I don't have a clue as to how I got here tonight. I had a maps go and everything. I started just coming this direction. I think I told you last year that the Churches of Christ in the Dallas-Fort Worth area need to buy a helicopter for those of us who go different places. I mean, you could take Robert someplace and you could take me someplace. Anybody that goes across town, you need a helicopter just to drop us in over there because that's the only way we're going to find our way around. I was going to come down Route 26. How I got on Roof Snow Road is beyond me. But I knew kind of where I was when I got to that street. So I just came in from the west instead of the east. And I figured if I didn't get here, it'd be a 25,000 mile drive. So I'm grateful I found the place. I asked Robert last week, I said, how long do I have to speak? He said, you can speak as long as you want, but they leave at 8:15. And so we'll try to keep this close. I didn't realize, and I've got to issue an apology tonight, and I know you're not supposed to do that. He asked me what topic I wanted to speak on, and I told him I wanted to talk about the changing church. Now, that topic in and of itself is rather scary to people, so stay with me through the entire evening, and I think we'll make some sense of this whole thing. But the problem is, it took me 3 weeks to explain to Webb Chapel what I meant by this topic, so I at least have to come back one more year and give you the last half of this presentation, because it's a concern I have very simply because we live in a changing culture. Now, we'll talk more about that as we go along. I'll be more than happy to stay a little while after tonight in case you have any questions. I do have, of all things, an elders meeting to get to. Because of some questions that I have presented to them, and we're in the process of having lost 2 elders to cancer here recently in the first 6 months of this year. We're in the process of installing or presenting to the congregation another 4 more, and we're going to have to be working on that over the coming few weeks. And so please stay with me. I am not trying to disrupt this church or anything else. I have known preachers that go into a church on a one-time basis, express some things, create some problems, then he can leave. And then the preacher who stays behind has to deal with the shrapnel left over. That's not what I'm after. That's not what I'm trying to do. So hear me closely tonight, if you would, please. From Acts chapter 2, verses that are familiar to us and that we will be looking at over the coming 30 minutes for tonight, and then potentially even next year. Of course, that assumes you're going to get invited back, doesn't it? Beginning verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All of the believers were together and had everything in common, selling their possessions and goods they gave to anyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes. They ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God, enjoying the favor of all the people, and the Lord added to their number daily those that were being saved. Now, all of us have looked at that passage a lot of times, and I don't know what you get out of that passage, but that passage tells me 4 basic things that we're eventually going to get to maybe in 2016. 1, this was a learning church. It was a church that learned. 2, it was a fellowshipping church. Now, we have at Webb Chapel a process that we call fun, food, and fellowship, where we get together afterwards and we eat together. I think this fellowship is deeper and more intense than fun, food, and fellowship. I think the idea of us getting together and eating together is fine. I hope tonight tonight, for instance, at Webb Chapel, we're having a Devo and then we're having an ice cream social. And I'm missing an ice cream social. And that really ticks me. I have recently lost 35 pounds. I know I broke up with my girlfriend. That's Belle is her name, Blue Bell. And here tonight, they're going to be stuffing their faces with ice cream. I think this fellowship here in Acts chapter 2 is more than getting together and eating ice cream. It's a stronger, more intimate, across-the-table fellowship that you and I need to talk about at some point. Number 3, they are a worshiping church. They're a church that gets together and worship. Did you sense the awe that's in here? People had and were filled with awe. When was the last time you and I were filled with awe when we come to church? When church basically is the time we get together, we'll sing a few songs, we'll hear some poor guy come over from Webb Chapel and speak, and once we go home, we'll feel good about it, and we'll go home tonight, and that's probably the last time you'll worry about my speech until I come back next year and remind you. That's kind of how we do things. In fact, we have to have things in a certain order. We can't have anything out of order. My brother, and this is not to take all the pressure off of him. My brother today is not faithful to the church. One of my brothers. I have 3 brothers. I'm the first, never the oldest, always the first. I'm the alpha. The omega is preacher. Number 2 is a preacher. Number 3 is unfaithful to the church because he put some songs out of place and somebody came to him and said, don't you ever do that again. The Lord set in place how we're supposed to do worship around this place. And he walked away from the church because he didn't think that was any of their concern. Worship. When was the last time you were filled with awe at worship? Where you sensed the presence of God, where when it just felt like you were there doing what you're supposed to do. You're praying together and you're singing together and you're worshiping together and you're, for an audience of whom? I'm not up here preaching to an audience. We're here before an audience of one. When was the last time that ever enters our mind? Fourthly, it was a church of evangelism. It was a church that evangelized. Now, I assume you've seen and heard all the church bloopers. You have a computer, you probably have seen these. Bulletin. Don't worry. Don't let worry kill you. Let the church help. That was from a church bulletin. How about this one? Weight Watchers will meet at 2 p.m. Please use the double doors at the back entrance. How about this one? The 8th grader will present Shakespeare's Hamlet in the church basement, Friday, 7 p.m. The congregation is invited to attend this tragedy. The preacher, Adam, spoke briefly, much to the delight of the audience. Have you ever heard that there's no such thing as a bad short sermon? Yeah, I hear it every Sunday. Remember in prayer the many who are sick of our church and community. The low self-esteem support group will meet Thursday at 7 p.m. Please use the back door. Or in a bulletin for after one minister got sick, during a minister's illness, God is good, Dr. Hargrave is better. How about this one? The preacher will preach his farewell message, after which the choir will sing, break forth in joy. This afternoon there will be a meeting in the south and north ends of the church. Children will be baptized at both ends. One more and we're done. Thursday night, potluck supper, prayer and medication to follow. All in church bulletins. Funny? Yes. But in spite of these kinds of things, and we've talked about church, haven't we? We talk about church all the time. You know, the squeaky wheel concept. Elders hear the squeaky wheels. We don't have any squeaky wheels here tonight, do we? And elders, keep your hands down. In spite of all that, brethren, the church is important. Jesus Christ died for the church. I'm grateful for the prayer of our brother who prayed that the Lord one of these days will come back to take his church. He is looking for his bride. We are the bride of Christ. The church is a special, special place. And when Jesus said, I will build my church as he promised, and he said the gates of hell will not prevent me or stand up against it, and he suggests to us that there's going to be a new kind of a kingdom, there's a new kind of a covenant, and we too often equate this church, this covenant, to this building. And I'm going to suggest to you tonight, you need to change that thinking. The church at College Hill is sitting in its pews. And you folks need to see yourself as the church. You folks need to see yourselves as the ones for whom Christ died. And the old saying is that if God had a refrigerator, your picture would be on it. Why? Because you are the church he died for. Jesus called the church, his ecclesia, out of the world, John 17. He calls us out of the world, not to literally leave it, but to be drawn out of it because of our thinking and because of our attitude. The question to me is, if we are going to be a church that changes society and culture, then we have to have a better idea of who we are and what we are so we can at least delve into this culture of ours. We are to be, for lack of a better term, and I haven't found anything else better, we are to be countercultural. We're not to be arrogant. We're not to be looking down our noses at anybody. We're not to be angry at folks. We're not to pick on folks. We're not to tell them how bound for hell they are if they don't come to church with me tonight. That's not the point. The point is your life and my life has to be so different that there is a sense in which people understand that there's a difference between you and them. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 11, 12, and 13. Peter is talking about the end times, and he asks a very interesting question. He asks the question, when those things begin to happen, when the Lord finally comes, when the church is finally taken home. Peter's question is, what kind of people ought we to be? What kind of a church do you have here? What's the purpose of church? How do you look at church? I got to thinking just the other day, and I shared this with the folks at Webb Chapel. You know how many church books there are? I just started looking through CBD, Christian Book Distributors, McDonaldization of the Church, written in 2000. The Church of Irresistible Influence, 2001. The Changing World, Changing Church, 2001. The Church Next, 2001. The Provocative Church, 2002. Liquid Church, 2002. Mission Shaped Church, 2004. The Emerging Church, 2004. The Church Invisible, 2004. The Responsive Church, 2005. Emerging Churches, 2006. Sticky Church, 2008. Irresistible Church, 2011. And Centered Church, 2012. And then I went to my library. Guess what? Church Diversity. Who Stole My Church? Barefoot Church. Making Church Great. Sticky Churches. Dangerous Churches. Your Church is Too Safe. Jim and Casper Go to Church. I want to mention that one in just a minute. The Church of Irresistible Influence, I already mentioned. Dear Church, written by people who don't like church anymore. Why Churches Die. Building a Contagious Church. And one just simply called The Church. This Jim and Casper Go to Church is a book written by a Christian believer, not a Church of Christ, but a believer. It's written by a believer and an atheist. And they both go to church together, and they talk about what they see and what they don't see. The church is an interesting insight into what atheists see when they come to churches. A good friend of mine, Ron Carlson, preaches at Duncanville. He's written a book. He's written several books, but one of them in particular, he talks about bringing a friend to church, and his friend is almost overcome with the shakes because he said, I can't go in there. Ron says, why? He said, look at them. They look like Norman Rockwell people. So what do you mean? He said, they're all smiling. They got white teeth. They're all dressed up. They look too pretty. They look like they come from a painting. I can't go in there. And the list of books says to me that a lot of people are trying to figure out who we are as a church. What does a church look like, really? Do we just come to these assemblies? Do we sit in pews always and look at the back of somebody's head? Is there a better way to do church? Now again, stay with me. I love the church. born and raised in the church. I'm not changing the basic principles of the church. I'm simply asking, is what we do the best way to do it? Or should we provide more ways for us to be not only inside the building, but outside the building? My youngest brother, Jim, talked to him just the other day. He preaches for a church in Omaha. I said, we're going to preach on this Sunday. He said, I'm not. I said, I want your gig. What are you going to do? He said, we're going to come together. We're going to meet around the Lord's table. We're going to say our prayers. We're going to have the bread. We're going to have the wine. We're going to have a challenge, and we're going to be gone in 25 minutes. Really? Why? What are you going to do? He said, we're turning our congregation loose to go into the neighborhood and help the neighborhood. Ever do that here? Would you do that here? There's a difference between saying we are the church and being the church. There's a difference between touting our own accomplishments and telling everybody we are the church of the New Testament. When I look at the passage we just read in Acts 2, everyone was filled with awe. All believers were together, selling their possession, and gave to anyone as he had need. Does that sound like they stayed in the building all the time? Now, I'm not against staying in the building. I'm glad you're here. I'm not trying to get you to not be back next week. I'm suggesting that there may be ways that we need to be a changing church. My concern, brethren, is not that we're changing away from the first century church. I'd rather us change back to the first century church. That's where I want us to go. I want us to be more like the first century church. I want us to be more outside the building, because that's where the church has the most impact. Why are there so many books? This quote, there's a sense that the church is increasingly out of tune with contemporary culture that unless it comes to terms with change, it faces extinction. Now, I don't think it's going to be extinct. It's not my church. And brother, sister, friend, it's not yours. It is the church of Jesus Christ. And he will not let it die. It hasn't died yet. It won't die simply because we don't understand the culture. So the question for me is not whether we're out of tune with contemporary culture. The question for me is, are we out of tune with God's vision for the church? It's not going to die. Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, Daniel says, in the days of these kings, and you need to read Daniel 2, and Nebuchadnezzar and the statue and the four kingdoms and all that kind of thing. In the days of these kings, God will establish a church that will never be destroyed. And so I'm not calling the church to be odd and weird and do silly things and act in crazy ways. That's not it at all. I'm calling us to the point where we know culture and we know it well enough to use the principles of the New Testament to teach the culture what it means to be a Christian. We need to find ways to proclaim the gospel in an increasingly postmodern culture. Now, I want to get to that term. And 10 minutes is not going to do it, but you're going to get the short version here. We are living in one of the most fascinating times in my life. I don't know how much you have thought about modern history and postmodern history and whether you even worry about the terms. I'm here to tell you that those of us over 60 think differently than those folks under 30. We do. I remember the days when I played under the porch and ate the dirt. And the paint didn't slow me down. But today, everything has to be so perfect and everything has to be done by laws and this and that and the other. The idea that we are in the same culture that you and I grew up in is absolutely wrong. And so when we talk about modern and postmodern, let me just kind of explain a couple of things to you. Most of our older folks, I'm included, have this sense that science, when we were growing up, science was king. Science would solve our problems. Science would bring education. Education would bring answers to everything. The pace was slower. The change was difficult. Change happened in a short amount, a long amount of time, and you worked in one place for 35, 40, 50 years. You retired there, and you went home with a pension, and everybody's happy. Today's young people live in a society where what was right yesterday and what was clear yesterday is not clear today. And they're going to change jobs not once, not twice, not 5 times, but 5 to 7 times in their lifetime. 5 to 7 major changes in their lifetime when you and I worked at one. You and I lived at time periods where it would take 200 years to change an idea. Not anymore. Are you aware of the fact that every day there's enough new information discovered to fill 8 sets of 24-volume encyclopedias every day? Knowledge used to double every 10, 15 years. Not anymore. Knowledge doubles every 5 years. And our young people are studying in schools for jobs that are not yet made. They have no clue what they're going to be doing. And I read the other day, this fascinating world we live in, that warp speed might be possible. And you thought Captain Kirk was silly. Warp speed might be possible. I read this morning, what a fascinating culture we live in. I read this morning now that they're linking up diapers with your smartphones. You see that? I got one yes. They link up diapers with your smartphone so that mom knows when you put the diaper on the baby, it pops up when the baby has a problem. And not only does it pop up that the baby has a problem, it tells you whether it's a number 1 or number 2 problem. Are you aware of that? What a wonderful country we live in. What a marvelous country we live in. Fiber optics, don't you like fiber optics? Fiber optics, you can, with one strand, you can send 16,000 telephone messages around the world. You can take a 24-volume set of encyclopedias and the King James Version of the Bible, and you can send that entire set of information around the world, one fiber optic strand, in 2 seconds. And on a copper wire, you could only get 16 people online at the same time. You remember the time when you said, Myrtle, would you attach me to 6-4? I want to talk to Melba. You remember that? What a marvelous country we live in. How about those microwave ovens that you don't even have to program anymore? You just put the meat in and punch a button, and the microwave says, but I don't understand how long to do this, so it contacts its maker, and they find out, and it starts itself. How about those medicine bottles that beeps at times you're supposed to take the medicine? How about the new paint they have on walls that you could you add a little electricity to it, and you change the color of the paint? Isn't it great? What a life we have. And we can't relate to the world about drugs or alcohol or divorce or out of wedlock marriages or anything like that. We can solve all those problems, but we can't solve these problems. That's what today's young people are facing, because all the science we had, all the education we had, didn't solve that problem. The problems that the young people today are saying is that science hasn't solved these problems. Science has given us green gas, greenhouse effects, all kinds of problems. So how do we deal with this? Modernism, modern people, the autonomy of the human reasoning, our objectivity of science, our love for science, and yet the postmoderns don't like necessarily facts and figures and black and white, They want warm fuzzies. Jim and Casper go to church. The book I have out in my car, I was reading it the 3 hours I got here before church tonight. The atheist and Jim, Casper's the atheist, he went to a church, big fancy church. I think it was Saddleback out in California. They went to church and saw Rick Warren and listened to all the fancy singing and all the bands and all the lights and whistles and all that kind of stuff. And Jim says to Casper, "What'd you think?" He said, "Let's talk about it over coffee." So they went out and had a cup of coffee, and they spent 2 hours over coffee. They talked about what they liked and what they didn't like, and Casper finally said, how did you come to Christ? What makes you feel that Jesus Christ is important in your life? And so they talked about it. And so Jim finally gets back to the fact is, now you're dancing around me here. What'd you like about tonight? He said, you know what really impressed me most? Is the time we've spent over coffee. So I can figure out who you are and why you believe this stuff called Christianity. See, you and I, we old folks, can take our Bible and we can argue with the best of them. Today's postmodern people they're not even sure that the Bible is what it says it is. Truth? What's truth? My truth is my truth, your truth is your truth. And the church has to deal with that. How does a preacher preach to a postmodern world? How does a class teacher teach a postmodern world when half the folks who are older believe there is truth and there's black and white, and some of our younger people are saying, wait a minute, why? You and I want facts and figures. We want book, chapter, and verse. Our younger people are wondering why we don't get more emotional in church. Where's the awe? You've become too complacent. You've become too flippant in your walk with Christ. Do you see what I'm saying? The idea is that the church, God's church, was designed for all cultures, all times, all countries, all places. And if we're not careful, we'll take the church and mold it into the image of Wayne White, and then he becomes upset when the church doesn't do what Wayne White wants. It's not my church, brethren. It's the church of Christ. And so we've got to find ways. And this is my challenge. I mean, the time is slipping away. We've got to find ways of saying to a postmodern world, there is a right and a wrong. But you know how we do it? We cannot start with book, chapter, and verse. They've got to see it in our lives. They've got to see us doing it. They've got to see us living by it. They've got to see, you cannot come in here and sing about how I love Jesus and go out and cuss like a sailor the rest of the week. And I'm not accusing you of doing that. I'm not accusing Webb Chapel of doing that. I will tell you this, we're using words today that we would never have used 60 years ago. Why? Because culture has changed, and bless our hearts, we go right along behind it. And we are changing in that respect. I think there are two kinds of changes. And I'm kind of off base here, but just hang on with me. There are two kinds of changes. One kind of a change is the change that we follow. I have shared with people at Webb Chapel, we feel comfortable as long as we're 10 paces behind the culture. If culture is here and we're here, that's okay because we're behind culture. Now, if culture goes way over here, where are we? Over there? No, we're right behind culture. We want to stay just as close as we can without becoming like culture. And the concern I have there is, you know, there's some things that I didn't do when I was a kid. Boy, is this being filmed? Yes. I didn't play cards. Is there anything wrong with cards? Probably not. How about pool halls? You didn't go to pool halls. I didn't go to sock hops. My dad wouldn't let me go to a movie. Not a movie. The first movie I got to see was Ben-Hur. And the reason he let me go there was the entire English class of high school was getting to go. And when I asked him why he didn't like for me to go to movies, he said, quote, because I saw one once. What does that mean? I saw one once? Well, see, he had this idea that a Christian ought to be like this. And if society moves off and we're just behind it, you see, we're changing right along with it. There's that kind of a change I'm concerned about. But there is another kind of a change. I want us to become students of our society. I want us to become PhDs, if you will, in what makes society tick. And then we need to work our programs to fit what processes help this culture. I have said this before. I commit to you that before I ever come back here again, I'm going to start one of these. I'm going to start a St. Arbuck's class. Starbucks, St. Arbuck's class. Are you with me? I'm going to take my Bible to Starbucks. And I'm going to sit down in the corner. I'm going to open it up and I'm going to read it for an hour. I dare somebody look at me, because I'm going to start a conversation. Lyle Asbill, who's no longer in this area, was a preacher at Grapevine. He and I went to Starbucks one day. Before he left, went to Florida. The audacity of that man. He went to Florida. We sat down and we were talking preacher things. And you know what? Instead of us engaging in somebody else, a very nice young lady 4 feet away turned around and said, "Are you folks ministers?" "Why, yes, we are." "I thought so. You sounded like it." She had her Bible out. Why didn't we approach her? No, she approached us. Do you see the difference? I want us to be so in tune with the culture. Is it going to take a St. Arbuck's class? Is it going to take special programs to get out into your community? Is it going to take some sense of agreeing that this is not the church and this is simply something we use to influence people outside these walls? Is it going to be something where we're going to have to learn what appeals to people and do what appeals to people to introduce them to Jesus Christ? I'm not talking about jumping up and down on their chest with the Bible. They don't think the Bible is worth anything until they see it worth something to you in your life. Then they will listen to you. But until they see it with you, until they see it with me, it's just not going to make a hill of beans worth of difference. One quick exercise that we'll close for tonight. There's so much more I want to tell you. Don't have the time. Imagine a circle. You see the circle? 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock. I'm backwards. See the circle? Divided into north and south, east and west, if you would, in your mind. The northeast quadrant. I think there are 4 kinds of Christians, and I'm using this in broad terms. 4 kinds of Christians. One, the northeast quadrant there are those people who want book, chapter, and verse. They go to church on time, they leave on time, they read their Bibles on time, they pray on time, they memorize, they want black and white. Here's what the Bible says, you do it, you'll be okay. Those are the kind of Christians. The bottom right-hand side are people who are not quite as concerned about the book, chapter, and verse as they are about the feelings and the emotion. Have you ever cried in church? Does anything ever appeal to you? How do you meet around the Lord's table? How do you meet around the Lord's table without some kind of an emotional response to that? How? So they want some response to that. They want the sermon to be something that draws their feelings out. Not that they're taken away with feelings, but that they're affected by them. The northwest quadrant in your mind are those people who have given up on church as far as going to church. They're not particularly pleased with going to church. They're not really sure that they want to go around the Lord's table and have warm fuzzies. What they want is they want to get out and feed the poor. They want to get out and clothe the naked. They want to get out and hand gloves out at Christmas time when it's cold. They want to hand out blankets because to them, that's what Christianity is. The bottom left corner in your mind are those people who really do forget the other 3, but they're contemplative. They like to go someplace and just sit down at their home and open the Bible and become monks. They just contemplate. I'm going to suggest to you, you ought to be all four of those. There's got to be a way in which you look at the Bible and say, this is my roadmap, this is my blueprint, this is what I live by, and this is how I act. And in the process, you also understand that there have to be some feelings in there. I don't know how you look at the cross without some feelings. I don't know how you think about nails pounded in wrists and feet without some feeling. I don't know how, you've seen The Passion of the Christ. Years ago, The Passion of the Christ came out. My wife refuses to see that, and I asked her why one time. She says, because I'm a mother. I don't want to see it. Real feelings. I think we ought to be on the street feeding folks too. I think we ought to give them blankets. I think we ought to give them gloves. Not and ignore the church, but that's part of it. And I think there are times, and I think this passage here, they're a learning church. I think that's what's talking about when you want to sit down with the Bible and you need to learn. Where is it, brother and sister, that says when you're 60, 70, 80 years of age, you get to give up reading the Bible and learning from it? Can you tell me that passage? It's not in my Bible. And somehow, because we've read Acts before, we don't read it again? Because we've looked at the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we don't read it again? Because we know what Paul wants for the church and all the things that he tells us, that we don't read it again? And again? When was the last time you had an aha moment reading through something and you thought, wow, I hadn't seen that before? If you hadn't had that experience in the last year, you're not reading enough. The changing church. I'm not wanting to change principles. I'm not wanting to change whether you meet every Sunday or not. I'm not wanting to take the Lord's Supper out of the worship. I'm not trying to take away baptism. I'm not trying to take any of that kind of stuff out. I want us to look again with fresh eyes at the church, because somehow the church 2,000 years ago had the same problems we had. They had divorce, they had adultery, they had kids thrown out because they weren't wanted, they had immorality, they had church fights, all of that kind of stuff, and grew anyway. And we somehow today are living in a Western culture in which church has become somewhat drab and dull, and people wonder, you still go to church? How do you answer that question? I don't know where your walk is with the Lord. Apparently here, every Wednesday night you offer an invitation. I don't know what your relationship is. If you're outside of Christ, you're outside of His church. If you're in Christ, you're in church, whether you want to be or not. If you're outside of Christ, there is no hope, there is no security, there is no peace, there is no future. We would invite you to come during the song tonight so we can hear your confession, so we can hear the commitment that you have, and baptize you into His body, the church. We'd love to do that. There may be some tonight who want to ask the elders here for prayers. They would love to do that, I'm sure. There may be somebody here tonight who wants to place membership with this fine congregation. Robert Waller will come back, welcome you. They will welcome you. He'll welcome you and just make you feel right at home and give you a job right here at College Hill. You don't think so? Just try it. If you're subject to the gospel, come right now while we stand, while we sing.